Hello and welcome to the next learning module on documentary film. In this tutorial, I'll go over a definition of documentary, look at some key terms, and different styles of documentary film. Let's start off with a definition. The most long-lasting definition of documentary film was provided by John Grierson, a filmmaker, who came up with the idea stating, documentary film is the creative treatment of actuality. Now, this simply means taking real elements from the real world and creatively putting them into a film. We'll have a chance to look at this later in this tutorial and in this learning module. Let's now take a look at some key terms and concepts in the world of documentary film. We'll start with epistemophilia. Epistemophilia is defined as the desire to learn about the world around us. Bill Nichols asserts that one of the most appealing aspects of documentary film is that it satisfies our sense of epistemophilia. Then there's a discourse of sobriety. Now, Bill Nichols states that documentary film operates as a discourse of sobriety, meaning that it presents itself as objective and truthful representations of reality in film form. One of the unique qualities of documentary film is that it can simultaneously operate as both an objective and subjective representation of reality. It operates as an objective representation of reality is because most of the visual elements come from the real world. Most of the people featured in documentary films are real people or non-actors, but that's not always necessarily the case. And the look of the film is less stylized than fiction film. Documentary film also operates as a subjective representation of reality because all of that footage must be edited, and that editing is often subjective. Also, recreations of the past are highly subjective, which is often seen in documentary, and sometimes interviews with subjects can be scripted. Let's take a look at what goes into making a documentary film. These are known as conventions. In documentary film, a convention is defined as a cinematic element or technique used to create the narrative specific to a documentary film. Examples of documentary film conventions include talking head interviews, archival or stock footage, reenactments, and voiceover narration. Let's talk about how documentary films are classified. Now, there are many classification schemes out there. The one that we're going to look at specifically is offered by Bill Nichols, who suggests that documentary films can be categorized into 6 different modes. Now, it's important to note that most documentary films are usually a combination of these modes. Rarely does one exhibit one mode exclusively, but there are some examples of that. The first is the poetic mode. The poetic documentary mode is characterized by how it emphasizes visual associations. It features repetitions of tonal or rhythmic qualities. It features descriptive passages that are both sound and image, and exhibits formal organizations. One thing to keep in mind is that this mode bears the closest resemblance to the experimental film and the formalist film style. An example of the poetic documentary mode is Berlin Symphony of a Metropolis. This 1927 film is essentially a tour of the city of Berlin, but it's done so in a creative and interesting way. Moving on to the expository documentary mode, which is characterized by how it emphasizes verbal commentary, has an argumentative logic, focuses more on information than imagery, addresses the viewer directly, and most often involves voice-over narration. This is the most common mode of documentary film in general and is most commonly associated with the classical film style. An example of this is the film The March of the Penguins. The observational documentary mode emphasizes a direct engagement with everyday life subjects. It's told from the perspective of an unobtrusive camera or fly-on-the-wall aesthetic. It usually involves less manipulation of the video footage. It also requires the filmmaker to remove themselves from the narrative, but that's not always the case. It also involves longer takes and slower editing. This documentary mode is often associated with the realistic film style. An example of the observational documentary mode is the film Primary. The participatory documentary mode emphasizes the interaction between the filmmaker and the subject matter. Filming takes place through talking head interviews or other interactions with subjects. This can be ethnographic in nature, where the filmmaker is a scientist or archaeologist interacting with, quote-unquote, the natives. It usually has a strong rhetorical stance and is similar to the expository mode in tone and style. An example of the participatory documentary mode is the film Roger and Me by Michael Moore. The reflexive documentary mode calls attention to the filmmaking process. It increases our awareness of the constructed nature of documentary film. It usually requires the presence of the filmmaker in the visual reality of the film. It too has a strong rhetorical stance and has some experimental qualities in style and tone. A classic example of the reflexive documentary mode is A Man with a Movie Camera by Dziga Vertov in 1929. The performative documentary mode rejects any notion of objectivity. It often involves subjects performing to the camera and is well suited to allow underrepresented groups to tell their story. It draws on the poetic, expository, and observational modes in its execution. An example of this is the film Grey Gardens by Albert and David Maysles. Now, along with Bill Nichols' 6 modes of documentary, we're going to look at the mockumentary. Now, the mockumentary is a very popular form of entertainment, building on the conventions that are commonly associated with documentary film. It's often satirical in nature. It offers deadpan humor. It often involves improvisational performances, and it breaks the fourth wall. The earliest example of a mockumentary is the film This Is Spinal Tap by Rob Reiner in 1984. This concludes the documentary film tutorial. It's now time for you to move on to the short film clip viewing assignment.